Well, look at this thing. Somebody's grandma lose her grocery car. Or did you actually drive this heap on purpose? The words came before Calloway had even reached the window, before he had seen her face or heard her voice, before he had any reason at all to say anything except the kind of thing a man says when he has already decided what he is looking at and just needs the other person to confirm it. He said it the way some men say everything loudly, with the casual cruelty of someone who has never once been corrected for it. Highway 9 ran through the flat middle of Shelby Parish, Louisiana, the way a crease runs through an old folded map, straight forgotten and useful only to people who had nowhere better to be. By 4 in the afternoon, the sun had stopped being warm and started being punishing, pressing down on the blacktop until the air above it shimmered and twisted. There were no businesses out here, no cameras mounted on poles, no witnesses walking dogs or sitting on porches. There was just the road and the heat and the long emptiness of a place that had learned to mind its own business a long time ago. Officer Brett Calloway had been parked behind the billboard advertising a water park 3 counties over for the better part of an hour. The billboard was faded, the children on it bleached nearly white by years of Louisiana summers, and Calloway had chosen this spot the same way he chose most things, because it worked, and because no one had ever told him to stop. His cruiser's engine idled low. His sunglasses were propped on the dashboard, while he scrolled through his phone with one hand and kept the other near the radio, waiting for the particular kind of boredom that preceded the particular kind of entertainment he enjoyed most out here on the parish roads. The Ford Escort came into view from the north, moving at exactly the right speed, in exactly the right lane, committing no offense that any reasonable person could name. It was gray, or had been gray once, the paint now oxidized to a dull, chalky color that made it look like it was already apologizing for itself. The rear bumper had a small dent. One of the tail lights had a hairline crack running through the red plastic. It was the kind of car that said nothing about its driver, except that the driver did not have money, and to Calloway that was information enough. He pulled out from behind the billboard without turning on his lights, coasting up behind the Escort until his front bumper was close enough that the woman inside could see his face clearly in her rearview mirror if she chose to look, which she did, and which told him nothing because her expression did not change. Inside the Escort, Dara Wynne looked at the cruiser filling her mirror and felt precisely and completely annoyed, not afraid, not surprised. Annoyed the way a surgeon feels annoyed when someone interrupts an operation with a question about parking. She noted the cruiser's unit number. She noted the aggressive angle of his approach riding her bumper without cause. She noted that his hand was already resting on his belt as he climbed out of the car, and she noted the particular way he did not put his hat on, because men like him wanted you to see their eyes. She placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel and waited. Calloway came to the passenger side first, which was the move of a man who had done this enough times to know that approaching from the blind side rattled people, made them turn their heads, made them look guilty of something, even when they were guilty of nothing. He leaned down and looked through the glass. Before she had rolled the window down, his eyes moving across the interior of the car with the slow, deliberate examination of someone taking inventory of a space they already considered theirs. He saw the fast food wrappers on the floor, a paper bag from a burger place, a crumpled straw wrapper, a flattened cup without a lid. He saw the duffel bag sitting in the back seat, unzipped just enough to show the edge of a gray sweatshirt. He saw her sneakers worn at the heel and clean, but not new. And he saw her hands on the wheel, and he looked at all of these things the way a man looks when he is not gathering evidence, but confirming a story he has already written. She rolled the window down. License and registration, Calloway said, without greeting, without identifying himself, without explaining why he had stopped her. Because in his experience, explaining yourself to certain people was a form of respect, and respect was something he rationed carefully, based on criteria he had never written down but applied with perfect consistency. Dara asked quietly and without hostility what the reason for the stop was. Calloway's jaw tightened. He hated questions. In his mind, a question was a challenge, and a challenge from someone sitting in a car like this one dressed the way she was dressed was a particular kind of disrespect that he felt in the back of his teeth. He repeated his request louder this time, the way people repeat themselves when they believe the problem is volume rather than content. In the front console between the seats, sitting in the cup holder next to a gas receipt, was a black ballpoint pen. It was unremarkable in every visible way, the kind of pen you find in a junk drawer, the kind you pick up at a bank and forget to return. Calloway's eyes passed over it and moved on without registering it at all, which was precisely the point, because the pen contained a directional microphone with 16 hours of battery life and an encrypted transmission range of 2 miles. And every word Calloway had said since approaching the car had been received time-stamped and archived in a secure server in New Orleans. Over his radio, barely audible from inside the cruiser, Calloway had already broadcast to dispatch that he was conducting a stop on a vehicle with plates that returned restricted, requesting backup and reporting without being asked, without any physical evidence in the flat and practiced tone of a man reciting something he had said many times before, that he detected a possible odor of marijuana. 3 miles back down the highway, Deputy Owen Sears heard the transmission on his own radio and paused with his hand on his own steering wheel, because in 2 years on this job, he had noticed something that he had never said out loud to anyone, which was that Brett Calloway reported smelling marijuana at a rate that was statistically impossible if marijuana was actually what he was smelling, and that the vehicles he stopped for this particular odor shared almost no characteristics except one, and that characteristic was not the smell of marijuana. Sears turned his cruiser around and headed toward Highway 9. Dara stepped out of the car the way she had been trained to step out of cars, when the situation required absolute stillness and absolute visibility. Door opened slowly, both hands appearing before the rest of her body. Full height achieved without sudden movement, feet planted shoulder-width apart on the gravel shoulder, as if she had been standing on this particular patch of road her entire life. She was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and she carried herself with the kind of physical economy that comes not from confidence alone, but from years of training that had taught her body to do only what was necessary and nothing more. Calloway looked at her sneakers. He looked at the fraying at the hem of her jeans. He looked at the faded gray of her hoodie, which had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and shapeless, and he saw in all of these things exactly what he expected to see, and because he expected to see it, he could not see anything else. "Turn around," Calloway said, making a spinning gesture with one finger. "Hands on the hood," Dara said evenly and without heat. "Glove box." That was all she said. 2 words offering him the clearest and fastest route out of a situation that was about to become very bad for him, if only he had the capacity to hear what she was actually telling him, instead of hearing what he had already decided she would say. Calloway did not hear it. He heard defiance, which was the only language he was currently listening for, and he stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder and pushed her toward the hood of the car with a force that was not necessary for safety and had nothing to do with procedure. Deputy Owen Sears pulled his cruiser onto the shoulder 30 yards back and stepped out as Dara's palms made contact with the hot metal of the hood. He saw her hands spread flat against the surface. He saw her face turned sideways, cheek not quite touching the windshield, eyes forward, breathing measured and slow. She was not resisting. Her body communicated with perfect clarity the posture of someone who had made a deliberate decision not to fight, which was different from someone who did not know how. Calloway conducted the pat-down with more force than the situation required, and less precision than the procedure demanded, his hands moving in a way that served no law enforcement purpose. And Sears watched this from 30 yards, and felt the specific discomfort of a man who knows something is wrong, but does not yet know what to call it, or what to do with that knowledge. Calloway found her wallet. He opened it and read her name, Dara Wynn, and saw the driver's license with no permanent address listed, and he turned the wallet over and shook it and rifled through the card slots, and then he walked to the passenger side of the Escort and opened the glove box. And inside the glove box, resting on top of the vehicle registration for an entity that did not exist in any public record, was a leather credential wallet with the seal of the Department of Justice embossed in gold on the front cover. Calloway picked it up with 2 fingers as if it might be hot. He flipped it open. The badge was gold and clean and caught the afternoon sun and reflected it back at him with a clarity that felt almost unkind. He read the text below the seal. He looked at the photograph beside the badge number. He looked back at the woman with her palms on the hood of the car. He looked at the badge again. Sears was close enough to see Calloway's shoulders change, close enough to see the way his posture shifted from the loose confidence of a man who owns the situation to something smaller and tighter and harder to name. Sears took 2 steps forward, and then Calloway did something that Sears would replay in his memory for the rest of that night and into the following morning. Calloway closed the credential wallet, looked around once in each direction, and put it in the front pocket of his uniform pants. Then he turned around and walked back to Dara with an expression so carefully constructed to look normal that it looked like nothing at all. Just trash. Calloway called back to Sears loudly, his voice carrying an ease that his eyes did not match. "No ID, no badge. She's got nothing." Sears stopped walking. He looked at Calloway. He looked at the escort. He looked at Dara, who had turned her head slightly on the hood of the car and was looking directly at him. Not pleading, not angry, not afraid, just looking at him with a steadiness that felt less like a request and more like a statement of fact, the way a compass needle points north, not because it is asking you to go there, but because that is simply the direction it knows. Calloway snapped the cuffs onto Dara's wrists, too tight, the metal biting into the bone, and walked her to the back of his cruiser, and as the door closed behind her, Dara turned her head and looked once more through the rear window at the gray Ford Escort, sitting alone on the shoulder of Highway 9, and the look on her face was not distress. It was the look of someone checking that a door has closed properly before a sequence begins that cannot be stopped. Sears stood on the gravel and watched the cruiser pull away and did not move for several seconds, and the highway was quiet, except for the wind and the distant sound of a truck somewhere far down the road. The Shelby Parish Police Department had been built in 1979 and had been updated in the way that institutions update when they do not actually want to change a coat of paint. Here a new computer terminal there, a security camera in the lobby that the desk sergeant had quietly angled toward the ceiling 3 years ago because it made him uncomfortable to be watched while he ate his lunch. The floors were linoleum, and the linoleum was the color of old mustard, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with the particular frequency of a sound that was not quite loud enough to complain about, but never quite stopped. Dara was walked through the side door, not the front, because the front had a window facing the street, and Calloway preferred the side where the only person who could see you arrive was Greta Hollins at the booking desk, and Greta had been at the booking desk for 11 years, and had learned a long time ago that the things she noticed and the things she mentioned were 2 separate categories that she was careful not to mix. Calloway announced the charges as he walked Dara through the door, his voice raised to the level of a man who wants an audience listing each count with the practiced rhythm of someone who has recited these particular words so many times that they have stopped meaning anything and exist now only as sounds that produce a desired effect. The effect being that everyone within earshot orients themselves around his version of the story before any other version has a chance to exist. Greta looked up from the booking form. She looked at Dara, the calm hands, the straight back, the expression that was not the expression of someone who had been caught doing something. And she looked at Calloway, and she felt something move through her that she did not examine closely, and she looked back down at the form. Dara looked at the security camera mounted in the upper corner of the booking room, a small black dome, and she could tell from the angle of the lens that it was recording. She said one sentence clearly, and without raising her voice into the general direction of that camera, and then she did not speak again for the remainder of the booking process, because she had said what needed to be said to the only audience that mattered, and everything else was noise. Calloway pushed her down the hallway toward the cells before the booking process was complete. No fingerprints, no photograph, no phone call. Moving fast, talking over her, filling the air with words, the way people fill air with words when they are afraid of what the silence might contain. Cell 3 had a metal cot with a mattress approximately 2 inches thick, a toilet in the corner with no privacy partition, and a small window set high in the wall that let in a rectangle of gray afternoon light. And it had sitting on the far end of the cot, with her hands folded in her lap, a woman named Vera Dobbs. Vera was 63 years old, and she had been in this cell for 6 hours and 40 minutes, which she knew precisely because she had been counting the way people count when counting is the only form of control they have left. She had been stopped in the parking lot of a hardware store on the south end of town, questioned about her reason for being there, informed that there had been reports of loitering in the area, and brought in without being told under what charge. Without being allowed to call her son. Without being given any explanation that contained either law or reason because Brett Calloway had been having a slow afternoon. Dara sat down on the other end of the cot and looked at Vera. And Vera looked back at her, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the rectangle of gray light moved slowly across the floor as the afternoon went on. Chief Raymond Polk's office smelled of cedar and old paper and the particular kind of seriousness that accumulates in a room where power has been exercised for a long time without being questioned. The desk was dark mahogany, broad and clear of clutter, the way powerful men's desks often are not, because there is nothing to do, but because the work has been delegated so completely that what remains for the man at the desk is not work, but the supervision of outcomes he has already decided upon. On the wall behind him hung his commission photograph, his certification, plaques, a citation from the parish council, and a framed picture of Polk standing with the governor at a fundraiser dinner, both of them smiling the identical smile of men who understand each other perfectly. Polk's hair was the precise silver white of a man who has aged exactly as much as he intended to, and no more cut short and maintained with a regularity that suggested discipline or vanity or both. And his uniform was pressed with a sharpness that made the fabric look structural rather than soft. He was reviewing numbers in a ledger that was not the official departmental budget. When Calloway opened the door without knocking, stepped inside and closed it behind him, and the fact that Calloway did not knock told Polk before Calloway had said a single word that whatever had happened was bad enough that Calloway had forgotten the rules. Calloway put the credential wallet on the desk. Polk did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at a thing before touching it when he suspects that touching it will change something he cannot change back. Then he reached forward and opened it, and he read the text, and he looked at the photograph, and he closed it again and set it down precisely where Calloway had placed it, and he was quiet. "Who saw it?" Polk asked. The question was not about guilt or innocence or what the right thing to do was. The question was, as it always was with Polk, about containment, about how much of the problem existed inside the walls of this room, and how much of it was already outside, spreading the way spilled water spreads following every crack and slope until it finds the lowest point. Calloway told him that Sears had been at the scene but had not seen the badge clearly, that he had told Sears the car was clean, that Sears seemed to have accepted this. He told him about the restricted access flag on the plate and said he thought the system might have been glitching. He said this with the hope that Polk would agree because Calloway needed to believe still that there was a version of this situation that he could control. Polk stood and walked to the window and looked at the impound lot below where a tow truck was dragging the gray Ford Escort through the chain-link gate, and he stood there for a moment that lasted long enough for Calloway to understand that whatever came next had already been decided. "She wasn't just passing through," Polk said, still looking at the impound lot. "I know, but she was here for us." Polk turned from the window. "Which means there are people somewhere who know where she is and are waiting to hear from her." The room was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Polk went to his desk, opened the lower left drawer, and removed a clear plastic evidence bag containing approximately 40 grams of white powder that had been logged into the departmental evidence system 18 months ago as destroyed, and had in fact never been destroyed, because Polk believed in keeping resources available for moments exactly like this one. He set the bag on the desk between them and looked at Calloway with the calm of a man who has already moved past the question of whether to do the wrong thing and is now simply explaining the method. Calloway looked at the bag, and then at Polk, and then at the bag again, and the part of him that was still the person he had been before this afternoon. Before the credential wallet and the level 5 clearance flag, that part of him understood exactly what he was being handed and what it meant to take it. But the part of him that had been running from accountability his entire career, the part that had been bailed out and covered for and shielded from consequence so many times, that consequence had started to feel like something that happened to other people. That part reached out and took the bag, and that was the last decision Brett Calloway made as a free man. The impound lot behind the station was lit by 2 yellow sodium lamps that turned everything beneath them the color of old photographs. And in that amber half-light, Calloway moved between the rows of seized vehicles with the practiced calm of someone who has done things in this lot before that were not in any manual and had never been reviewed by anyone. The stray animals that sometimes made their way inside the fence had long since learned to keep their distance from uniformed men moving with purpose at this hour, and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway and the occasional metallic tick of cooling engines. He found the escort in the 3rd row. He was wearing latex gloves, which he had taken from the medical kit in his cruiser and which he had told himself were standard practice, a layer of professional habit that he would have applied to any evidence handling, though the truth was that he had never worn them for evidence handling before tonight and had thought to wear them now because some part of his brain, the part that was still operating with something like self-preservation instinct, had recognized that what he was about to do was the kind of thing that left traces. He opened the driver's side door. He pulled up the floor mat, which smelled of rubber and old moisture, and something faintly chemical that he didn't examine too closely. He took a short folding knife from his pocket and made a careful incision in the carpet lining near the base of the seat, working the blade slowly to keep the cut clean and narrow, then pressed the bag of powder into the gap until it sat flush beneath the surface with only one corner of the plastic visible if you were looking closely from exactly the right angle. He stood up. He stripped the latex gloves off and turned them inside out. He looked at his hands in the yellow light, and they looked like his hands, which was the problem with hands. They always looked like themselves, regardless of what they had done. And this had always seemed unfair to him, that there was no visible record on the surface of the body of the things the body had participated in. He did not look up. At 212 feet above the impound lot, the drone hung motionless in the evening air, its rotors running at a frequency below ambient noise. Its 4K optical sensor locked onto the gray Ford Escort with the kind of patient, unblinking attention that human beings can only sustain for minutes, but machines maintain indefinitely. The microphone array had captured the sound of the knife opening. The camera had captured the movement of Calloway's right hand as it pressed the bag beneath the carpet. It had captured the angle of his body, the position of his feet, the precise moment when he stood and turned away. In the operations center in New Orleans, special agent in charge, Alton Webb stood in front of a wall-mounted monitor with his arms folded across his chest, and he watched the playback twice. Not because he needed to see it twice, but because the first time he watched a man plant evidence on a federal vehicle to frame a federal agent, he always made himself watch it again because the second time was the time he stopped feeling surprised and started feeling certain, and certainty was what the next 12 hours were going to require. He uncrossed his arms and turned to the room. "Notify the U.S. Attorney," Webb said. "We're moving tonight." The booking room had emptied by 9 o'clock. The fluorescent light above Sears's desk buzzed with its usual indifference to the hour, and the papers in front of him, a report about a trespassing complaint on the eastern edge of the parish, had not been added to since 8:45 when he had stopped reading and started thinking. He was thinking about the way Calloway's shoulders had changed at the car. He had seen Calloway find things in vehicles before. He had seen him find actual things. A folding knife, once a small quantity of pills, and Calloway's body, when he found something real, moved with a particular energy, a rising animation, the behavior of a man whose story is being confirmed. What Sears had seen at the escort was different. What he had seen was Calloway becoming very still and then becoming very busy, in a sequence that people who are trained to notice things and then trained to ignore what they notice would recognize as the sequence of containment rather than discovery. Sears typed the name Dara Wynn into the departmental database. Restricted. Level 5 clearance required. He sat with that for a long time. A standard civilian record came back in seconds. Name, DOB address, priors if any. A sealed juvenile file came back restricted at Level 2. Level 5 was a clearance that Sears had encountered exactly once before in his 2 years here, when a deputy had accidentally run the plate of an undercover DEA vehicle and been called into Polk's office within the hour and told very quietly to delete the search and not mention it. Sears looked at the screen. He looked down the hall toward the closed door of Cell 3. He looked at the clock. It was 9:14. He stood up, walked to Chief Polk's office, knocked, entered, and asked in a voice he kept deliberately neutral whether the woman in Cell 3 had been properly processed, whether her property had been inventoried, and whether Calloway had logged everything found during the vehicle search. Polk looked at him for exactly 3 seconds and told him pleasantly that Calloway had handled it by the book and that Sears should finish his report and head home. Sears nodded. He returned to his desk. He did not finish his report. He logged out of the terminal, took his personal cell phone from his jacket pocket, walked outside to the parking lot, sat in his own car in the dark, and found the number for the FBI field office in New Orleans. He sat with the phone in his hand for a very long time. Then he pressed call. Dara was counting backward from the last check-in. She did this with her eyes closed and her back against the wall of Cell 3 sitting on the floor because the cot was too soft for what her body needed right now, which was not rest, but the kind of precise, grounded stillness that let her think with the most possible clarity. 3 hours and 40 minutes since the stop on Highway 9. The protocol was simple and had been designed to be simple because complex protocols failed at exactly the moments when simplicity mattered most. If she missed a check-in window by more than 90 minutes, the secure app on her phone, currently sitting in an evidence bag in Calloway's cruiser, would push her GPS coordinates to the Task Force Operations Center, along with a yellow status alert. At the 3-hour mark, yellow became red. She had been at 3 hours and 40 minutes for the last 12 minutes. Webb had the location. Webb had the status. The question was not whether anyone was coming. The question was what Calloway and Polk were going to do in the hours between now and when the machinery arrived, and whether the thing they were doing in the impound lot was what she thought it was, and whether she had given them enough rope. Vera was sitting on the cot with her arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth because the cell was not cold, but in the way people hold themselves when they have been frightened for long enough that the body has started doing the comforting because the mind has run out of words for it. Dara opened her eyes and looked at Vera and asked her what had happened, not the official version, not the charge, what had actually happened. Vera told her. She told her about the hardware store parking lot, about Calloway, asking why she was sitting in her own car, about being told she matched a description of someone, about the question of the description never being answered when she asked what the description was. She told it in the straightforward, slightly weary way of someone who has explained an injustice enough times that the telling of it no longer surprises them, only exhausts them. And in Vera's exhaustion, Dara heard the sound of a place that had been doing this to people for a very long time. When Vera finished, Dara looked at her for a moment and said, "Your name is going in the report, the official one, not as a footnote." Vera looked at her. "You some kind of lawyer?" Dara said nothing which Vera took for a no. The rectangle of light from the high window had long since disappeared, replaced by the flat orange glow of the sodium lamp from the impound lot. And in that light, Vera's face looked older and more tired than it had any right to look, and Dara thought about the 48 other names in the operational file that she had memorized before leaving New Orleans, and she closed her eyes and kept counting. The FBI's operations center occupied the 4th floor of a building in New Orleans that had no identifying signage, and it was lit with the cool, even light of a space designed for long hours of concentrated attention. The kind of light that does not flicker and does not soften and does not allow the eye to find a comfortable place to rest. At 10:17 in the evening, the room held 11 people and none of them were sitting down. The main display wall showed 6 simultaneous feeds, the live drone view of the Shelby Parish impound lot, a satellite overlay of the area surrounding the station, the audio transcript scrolling in real time from the recording pen in Dara's car, Dara's biometric data from the watch she was still wearing, heart rate elevated to 82, respiration normal movement, minimal the GPS position of Calloway's cruiser, and a still frame from 43 minutes ago, showing the unmistakable shape of Calloway's hand pressing a bag of white powder beneath the carpet of a federal undercover vehicle. Alton Webb had watched that last image for as long as he allowed himself to, which was long enough to be certain and not a second longer, and then he had turned to his team and begun speaking in the even unhurried voice of someone who has prepared for this exact moment and has no interest in drama when precision is available. The operation changed status from surveillance to interdiction at 10:19 p.m. A federal arrest warrant had been signed by a duty judge at 10:09, minutes before Webb formally changed the status, because Webb had been watching the impound lot feed since 7 p.m. and had known by 7:23 where the evening was going. The warrant covered Calloway Polk and 4 additional officers named in the operational file. The search warrant for the station, the impound lot, and Polk's home had been signed at the same time by the same judge who had looked at the drone footage for approximately 90 seconds before reaching for his pen. The SWAT team from the Baton Rouge field office had been staged 8 miles north of Shelby Parish since 9 o'clock in a warehouse parking lot, waiting in vehicles that showed nothing on the outside to suggest what was inside. There were 14 of them, along with a federal transport unit, a crime scene team, and 2 federal prosecutors who had driven from New Orleans specifically to be present for what came next, because this was the kind of case you were present for. Webb put on his jacket and looked at the biometric display showing Dara's heart rate. "She knows we're coming," said analyst Kira Odom from her position at the monitoring station, not phrasing it as a question because it was not a question. "She also knows she's fine," Webb said, and there was something in his voice that was not professional detachment and was not worry either, but was the specific feeling of a man who has sent someone into a dangerous place and is now close enough to the moment of retrieval that he can almost let himself believe the retrieval will go smoothly, but not quite. Not yet, not until she is standing in front of him in a building that is not a parish jail. He looked at the convoy logistics display on the secondary monitor. "Air support is already overhead," Kira confirmed. "Units are staged. The phone team is ready to initiate simultaneous contact with every line in the building on my mark." Webb looked at the image of the Shelby Parish Police Department on the satellite overlay the rectangular footprint of the building, the chain-link perimeter of the impound lot, the 2 access roads, the position of the nearby structures. And he looked at it with the attention of someone who has spent his career learning that the difference between a successful operation and a catastrophic one often comes down to what you see in a building's shape before you enter it. "Hold until 2 a.m., Webb said. "I want Polk to have time to shred everything he's going to shred. I want Calloway to think he's won." He paused. "Then we take it all." The field office in New Orleans had answered on the second ring, which had surprised him. And then a voice had asked his name and his badge number and his location, and he had given all 3. And then the voice had asked him to hold, and he had held for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He counted before a different voice came on the line, calmer and more deliberate, and asked him what he had seen. He told it in order beginning to end the way he had been trained to report things. The traffic stop, the restricted plate return, the way Calloway's body had changed at the glove box, the way Calloway had said nothing, and the way nothing had looked on his face when he said it. He told them about the Level 5 return on the name search. He told them about Polk's office, the 3 seconds of silence, the answer that had been shaped too carefully, to be honest. The voice on the phone thanked him and asked him to do nothing, to say nothing, to return to normal activity as if the conversation had not occurred. It told him that he had done the right thing. It did not tell him anything else. Sears put his phone in his jacket pocket and sat in the dark of his car for another few minutes, looking at the side of the building where the light came through the frosted glass window of the booking area. And he thought about what the right thing was specifically and whether doing it once at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night was the same as having done it all the times before, when he had noticed things and cataloged them quietly and told himself that it wasn't his call, and he was too new, and the system was too big, and one person couldn't change the direction of something that had been moving this way for longer than he had been alive. The window he was looking at was the booking room window, and somewhere behind that wall was Cell 3, and in Cell 3 was a woman whose name returned Level 5 clearance, and who had looked at him from the hood of a car with an expression that had not asked him for anything, which was, he thought now, the most honest thing anyone had communicated to him in the 2 years he had worked in this building. He went back inside. He sat at his desk. He typed 4 more lines of the trespassing report, and then stopped. He looked at the hallway. He looked at the clock, which read 10:47. He opened a new document on his terminal and began typing a detailed incident report, time-location observations, verbatim dialogue as close as his memory could supply, and he saved it to his personal encrypted drive, not the departmental server, and he printed 1 copy and folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he did something that cost him something, a small but real expenditure of something he hadn't known he was carrying, until he spent it. He went to the break room, made 2 cups of bad institutional coffee, walked down the hallway to the cell block and slid 1 cup through the slot at the bottom of Cell 3's door, without saying anything. And he stood there for a moment in the hallway listening to the quiet, and then he went back to his desk and waited for whatever was coming, because he had made his call, and now it was coming whether he was ready or not. Brett Calloway was on his 2nd beer when the sports recap started, and he was feeling for the first time since 4 o'clock that afternoon something close to settled. The apartment was warm and cluttered in the comfortable way of a man who lives alone by preference. The television's light moving across the walls, the sound low enough that he had to watch the closed captions, which he preferred anyway because it gave his eyes something to do. The credential wallet was no longer in his pocket. It was at the bottom of his neighbor's recycling bin, 3 buildings over, tucked inside a paper bag from a fast food place, because he had driven there at 8:30 specifically for this purpose and had done it without touching the wallet, directly using the gloves again. And he had told himself on the drive back that this was the right move, the clean move, and he had almost believed it. Chief Polk was in his office on the 2nd floor, and he had been shredding documents for 90 minutes, and the shredder had overheated once, and he had waited for it to cool, and then continued working through a filing cabinet drawer that contained, among other things, a ledger of quarterly payments from 3 businesses in the parish that had been operating under an informal understanding with the department for the better part of a decade, and correspondence between Polk and a circuit court judge, whose name appeared in the operational file on the 4th floor of the building in New Orleans under the heading Targets Secondary, and a folder of internal affairs complaints that had been received acknowledged with a form letter and then stored here rather than forwarded to the State Oversight Board because forwarding them had never served any purpose that Polk could identify. Vera was asleep finally, her head against the wall, her arms still folded, her breathing slow and even in the way that people sleep when they have been awake long enough that the body simply takes over and removes the choice from the situation. Dara was not asleep. She had not slept because she did not need to sleep and because the next several hours were going to require her to be fully present in a way that sleep, however brief, might compromise. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her legs extended, and she was aware of the time. The way a surgeon is aware of the time, not anxiously, not impatiently, but as a precise quantity of a finite resource being spent at a known rate toward a known outcome. A cup of coffee had appeared through the slot at the bottom of the door at some point in the previous hour. She had looked at it for a moment and then picked it up and drank it because it was cold in the cell, and because accepting a gesture that costs someone something is its own form of acknowledgement. At 1:47 a.m. every phone in the Shelby Parish Police Department began to ring. Not just the main desk. Every phone. The desk phones, the backup lines, the fax machine, the phone in the break room, the phone in the equipment closet that no one had used since 2019 and had forgotten was still connected. They rang simultaneously and without stopping, which was a coordination technology that the FBI's communication team had spent 11 minutes setting up, and that produced in the empty building at 2 in the morning a sound that was less like a collection of phones ringing and more like an alarm designed by someone who understood that certain kinds of fear live in the interval between normal and unrecognizable. Greta Hollins, who had stayed late for reasons she could not entirely explain to herself, stood at the dispatch desk and looked at the board of ringing lines, and then looked at the front glass doors of the building. And outside the glass doors, she saw red and blue light painting the parking lot in rotating color. And the light was not from 1 unit or 2 units or even 10 units. And she picked up the nearest phone and heard, before she could say anything, a voice that identified itself as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She set the phone down without hanging it up and walked very slowly to the back of the room and sat down in her chair and did not move. Calloway saw the lights at the same moment his phone began ringing with a number he didn't recognize, and for approximately 2 seconds, he stood at the front glass doors of the station looking at what the parking lot had become, and thought with the specific unreality of a man whose mind is rejecting information that there must have been a major incident somewhere in the parish, a call-out of some kind, a convergence of units for some reason that had nothing to do with the gray Ford Escort or the bag of cocaine or the leather credential wallet that was currently inside a paper bag inside a recycling bin 3 blocks away. The second ended and the unreality ended with it, and what replaced it was the cold and total understanding of a man who has run out of road. He ran for the stairs. Polk was at the window of his second-floor office when Calloway came through the door, still holding a folder of papers that the shredder had not yet processed. Looking at the parking lot below with the expression of a man watching the conclusion of a story he has known the ending of for some time, but had hoped, with the irrational hope of powerful men who have avoided consequences for so long they mistake avoidance for immunity, might end differently. The parking lot held 9 black SUVs arranged to cover every exit. An armored vehicle sat at the main gate with its engine running. A helicopter moved slowly overhead, its spotlight sweeping across the roof with the patience of something that has all night. Calloway said something. Polk did not respond to what he said. He stood at the window for a moment longer, watching the agents moving in the lot below their movement. Precise, unhurried, the movement of people who have rehearsed this. And then he turned from the window and looked at Calloway with an expression that contained in proportions that shifted as Calloway watched exhaustion, contempt, and something that might have been at its lowest frequency relief. "You didn't check whether the car had a tracking system," Polk said. "I didn't. They couldn't have Calloway stopped." The sentence had nowhere to go. Polk set the unshredded folder on his desk. He reached for his gun belt and unbuckled it slowly with the deliberate movements of a man performing a ritual he has rehearsed in the privacy of his own worst imagination and set it on the desk beside the folder. Then he straightened his uniform shirt, pressed his cuffs flat against his wrists, and looked at Calloway with eyes that were empty of the particular quality that had made other men afraid of him for 30 years, because that quality required a future to project itself into, and Polk's future had just narrowed to a very small room. Calloway said he was not going down for this alone. Polk said he hadn't expected him to. Calloway said he would tell them everything, Polk, the judges, the businesses, all of it. Polk said quietly that Calloway was going to tell them all of that regardless because that was how these things went, and that it was not a threat, but simply a fact of what happened when the machinery of the federal government pointed itself at a small-town police department, and that the only remaining question of any interest was how much dignity either of them intended to retain on the way out. A voice from the loudspeaker outside filled the building with instructions that vibrated the glass. Calloway turned and ran toward the cell block. He took the hallway at full speed, keys already in his hand. The noise from outside becoming a continuous wall of sound, the helicopter, the amplified voice, the boots that had begun moving across the parking lot with a rhythm like something mechanical and inevitable. The hallway lights were on. Their night setting dimmed to an amber glow that made the walls look like the inside of something organic, and Calloway ran through it with the pure forward energy of a man who has narrowed his entire existence down to a single idea that has not yet revealed itself as impossible. The idea was if he had her, they would stop. It was the idea of someone who has spent his career using people as instruments and had not yet updated his understanding of the world sufficiently to grasp that the woman in cell 3 was not available to be used as an instrument. Had never been available for that, and had in fact been managing the terms of this situation since the moment he had first seen her in his rearview mirror on Highway 9 and begun, without knowing it, to work against himself. He found the key. He opened cell 3. Dara was standing in the center of the room, not against the wall, not on the cot, not near the door in the center. Feet planted, hands at her sides, the same posture she had maintained on the shoulder of Highway 9 when he had put her hands on the hood of her car, and the familiarity of it stopped him for a fraction of a second in a way that the gun in his hand did not, because the gun was his and the posture was hers, and in this moment he could not have explained which one carried more weight. He raised the gun. He told her to move. Vera on the cot behind Dara made a small sound and pressed herself against the wall. Dara looked at Calloway the way she had looked at him from the hood of the Escort, directly, steadily, with the quality of attention that contains no fear, because it has passed through fear and come out the other side into something quieter and much harder to move. And she said one word. No. The front entrance of the Shelby Parish Police Department came apart at that moment in the particular way that federal breaching teams have been trained to make entrances come apart, which is efficiently and completely and with a series of sounds that travel through the structure of a building and arrive in every room simultaneously, and Calloway's head turned toward those sounds for the single second that his training, such as it was, had never adequately prepared him not to turn. She was already moving when his head turned. The first move was her left hand on the barrel of the gun, rotating it away from her center line and down and to the outside in a single controlled motion that redirected the muzzle toward the wall in the time it took Calloway's attention to register what was happening, which was not enough time. The gun discharged once into the concrete wall, a crack that was enormous in the small room, and that Vera would describe later in the statement she gave to the federal investigators as the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. And the muzzle flash lit the cell for less than a second, and left behind a blue-white residue on the inside of Dara's vision that she blinked through without breaking movement. The second move was her right palm driving upward under his chin, her body weight transferring forward through the contact point, snapping his head back and breaking his forward balance entirely. The third move was the floor. He was on his back on the concrete before the sound of the gunshot had finished reverberating, and Dara was on top of him with her knee across his throat, not crushing, controlling, and the gun was in the hallway. She had cleared it there with the same motion that had ended his balance, and her hand was on his chest, and she could feel his heart slamming against her palm at a rate that told her everything she needed to know about what the last 30 seconds had been like for Brett Calloway. The door of the cell, filled with tactical gear and rifle muzzles, and the LED lights of helmet-mounted cameras, and a voice said, "Clear," and another voice said, "Agent secure. Suspect down." And Dara looked up at the team and said with the tone of someone noting a minor scheduling variance, 4 minutes late. The team lead crouched down. "You good? I'm good." They cuffed Calloway on the floor of cell 3, and the sound of the ratchet closing was the sound of a gear completing a rotation. It had begun approximately 10 hours earlier on a gravel shoulder on Highway 9, and Calloway stared up at the ceiling of the cell with his chest heaving and his hands behind his back, and the ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been, and it offered him nothing. The station was controlled chaos in the careful way that federal operations are chaotic people moving with purpose in every direction. Voices on radios, the sound of boot soles on linoleum, the particular bureaucratic noise of something large and corrupt being dismantled by people who have done this before and know which parts come first. Calloway was walked out through the side door, the same door he had used to bring Dara in 10 hours earlier, and the symmetry of this was not lost on anyone present, though no one commented on it because there were still things to do. Dara stood in the hallway outside the cell block where Webb had found her and shaken her hand and said something brief and private that she had received with a nod, and she was looking at the door of cell 3, which was standing open now, and Vera was standing just inside the threshold, her arms wrapped around herself again, looking out at the hallway with the expression of someone for whom the world has changed so quickly and completely in the last 30 seconds that the normal process of understanding has not yet caught up with the reality of the situation. Dara walked to the door. She stepped inside into the cell that smelled of industrial cleaner and old air, and she stood in front of Vera, and Vera looked at her. "You're going home tonight?" Dara said. "Your son is going to get a call in about 20 minutes telling him to come pick you up from the federal processing point on Route 11. Vera looked at her. "Your name," Dara continued, "is in the operational report. Not a footnote. Not an addendum. In the body of the report with your full name and what happened to you, because what happened to you is part of what this investigation is about, and you are not going to be erased from it." Vera's arms unfolded from around herself. She looked at Dara for a long moment with the particular attention of someone checking whether the person in front of them is real, and then her face did something complicated and uncontrolled, and she put one hand over her mouth, and the sound she made was very small, and came from somewhere that had been closed for a long time. Dara put her hand on Vera's shoulder just for a moment, just long enough to be real, and then she stepped back and let the federal victim's advocate who had appeared in the doorway take over, and she walked out into the hallway, and she did not look back, because looking back was not what the next part required. Outside, the night was cooling, and the lights from the vehicles in the parking lot threw long shadows across the asphalt, and somewhere across the lot, in the back of a federal transport vehicle, Brett Calloway sat with his wrists shackled to a floor ring and finally, for the first time in his adult life, had nothing left to say. The federal indictment against Brett Calloway contained 7 counts, and the count that carried the most weight, kidnapping of a federal officer in the course of her duties, carried a sentencing range that his defense attorney explained to him twice before he fully absorbed it, and then explained a third time when he still didn't seem to absorb it. And after the third explanation, Calloway sat in the consultation room at the Federal Detention Center and looked at the table and didn't ask any more questions. Chief Raymond Polk entered a plea agreement 14 days after the arrest. He gave the federal prosecutors the names of 2 circuit court judges, 1 county commissioner, and the owners of 3 businesses operating under protection arrangements with the department. And in exchange, he received a sentence that was still a sentence that still ended his career and his pension and his carefully maintained public reputation. But that left him with a number of years rather than a removal of years, and he signed the agreement without looking at his attorney when he signed it. Deputy Owen Sears was the only sworn officer of the Shelby Parish Police Department retained by the Interim Oversight Board appointed by the state. He was reassigned to a new unit operating under federal monitoring, and he showed up on his first day with the incident report he had printed and folded into his jacket pocket on the night of the operation, which he submitted to the board's ethics officer, and which became part of the public record of the investigation. 34 arrests made by Calloway over the preceding 3 years were reviewed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. 19 of them resulted in vacated convictions, released individuals, or settlement agreements with the people who had been processed through a system that had been using the machinery of the law to do something that had nothing to do with law for a very long time. Vera Dobbs received a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirming that she would receive financial compensation and that her name appeared in the official record of the federal investigation into the Shelby Parish Police Department. Her son, who had driven to the Route 11 federal processing point in the middle of the night in his work clothes, framed the letter and hung it in their kitchen. And when people asked about it, Vera said only that someone had kept a promise. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the night of the operation, a tow truck driver from a private impound company pulled the gray Ford Escort out of the Shelby Parish lot and drove it down Highway 9 toward a federal property facility 30 miles north. He had been told it was an undercover vehicle, and to treat it as evidence, which meant no radio, no GPS, no conversation with dispatch. He drove in silence, and the car behind him drove in silence, and the long flat road ran through the morning heat the way it always had without acknowledging anything that had happened on its shoulder, or what had come of it, because roads do not keep records and do not take sides. And the escort moved through the landscape that had swallowed it 10 hours one Tuesday afternoon, and released it now without comment, looking exactly as it had before the dented bumper, the chalky gray paint, the cracked taillight, because what had changed was not visible from the outside and had never been. Vera Dobbs was at her kitchen table at 6:45 in the morning when her son came downstairs in his robe and found her sitting with both hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the window where the early light was coming through the glass and laying itself across the table in a shape that shifted slowly as the sun moved. He asked if she had slept. She said some. He asked if she was all right. She looked at the light on the table and then at her son, and she thought about cell 3 and the cup of cold coffee that had come through the slot in the door at some point past midnight, and the woman who had said her name would be in the report, and she said yes, she was all right, and the thing in her voice when she said it was not the sound of someone reassuring another person, but the sound of someone who has arrived at a true answer to a real question, and is still a little surprised by it. Dara Wynne drove south on Highway 9 at 7 in the morning with the windows down and the radio off because the radio felt like too much and the wind felt like enough. She passed the faded billboard with the bleached children on it and did not slow down and did not look behind it because there was nothing behind it now that required her attention, and on the passenger seat beside her was a manila folder with a new city's name on the tab and a new set of documents inside another department, in another parish where something had been wrong for a long time, and where someone had decided that the way to handle the wrong thing was to make it larger and more wrong until it became impossible to see any other way. She didn't open the folder. She had read it twice already. She knew the names, the dates, the shape of the damage. She had done this long enough to know that the shape was always recognizable even when the details changed, and that the work was not the kind that ended, but the kind that continued, and that continuing was itself a form of answer to the question of whether it was worth doing. The highway was empty ahead of her, and the morning was wide open, and she kept driving south. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that dignity cannot be arrested, and truth cannot be buried forever, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to be made small. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, certain, and already on its way.